I'm making a video about the different types of materials that you can use to build a hull. For the most part, there's really only two options for this. There's fiberglass hulls and there's wood hulls. People have made over the years aluminum and different types of plastic, ABS based hulls. They're more on the fringe. I'd say the wood hull and the fiberglass hull are typically what we see. I'm going to talk about some of the advantages and disadvantages of each type. And so first off, we're going to start by looking at a fiberglass hull. Fiberglass, the first boat that we're going to look at is the Aoba. It's a cruiser, Japanese cruiser. One of the first things to think about actually is the similarities. So the hull and the hull shape is probably what differs the most. The upper parts of the boat are what is probably the most similar, no matter how you kind of build it. I would say that most of my boats and most of the boats that I see, the deck and subdeck are going to be made of wood. That's this section here. You're going to make the subdeck 1/4 inch and the deck itself a 1/8 inch out of wood, and then generally the superstructure out of whatever. For this, I do like ABS plastic on the superstructure. Sometimes if I want the deck colored look on the upper level, so make them out of wood. Either is okay. I think ABS is a little more resilient over time. This entire section was blown out in the past, and I had to replace that. It is made of wood, and I think wood is a little more, when it's thinner, it's a little more frail. You'll see here too, there's evidence where there's BB damage over time, and so you have to make some effort to repair that on wood hulls, and that's one of the things that we'll talk about as far as being a relative disadvantage, but it's also an advantage because it is fairly repairable. But anyway, so the Aoba fiberglass hulls, one of the first things actually that we should probably talk about is the rules for what on a hull gets to be open and what gets to be solid. And so essentially from stern to bow, from side to side, 15% of the ship gets to be solid, and the rest has to be open and will be covered then by 32nd inch balsa wood so that BBs can easily pass into them. Typically this is done with a 2-inch section in the bow, a 1-inch section in the far stern. That's mostly for support, and so that you can make the features of those parts of the ship without them being too fragile, because typically it's very thin back there and up there. And then typically I would say that we see mostly 1/4 inch ribs, and you basically just divide them up to cover the rest of the percentage of the hull. You want to oftentimes put more ribs where you're going to take more fire. So a lot of ships, that would be in the bow. Sometimes you'll put more ribs in areas that have side mounted guns. And then from the vertical standpoint, the hardness, that was horizontal. So vertically, ships get a 3/8 inch section of deck and subdeck, again usually configured with a 1/8 inch deck and 3/4 inch subdeck, and then 1 inch below where the water line would be, here the ship would be solid. Anything below that, or in this extreme stern or bow or anywhere else that it reaches a 45-degree slope, then you can make that area solid. And then also there's a rule that you can put features into the hull, or hulls that have various features such as torpedo bulges get a supporting structure. We call that a stringer. And so if you look laterally down the side of the Aoba here, you can see that the actual ship had a torpedo bulge on it, and so in order for that not to completely collapse every time it gets touched or a BB hits it, then you get to put a piece of supporting material there that's 1/8 inch wide. But essentially that's the limit. Then you get 3/4 inch plus an 1/8 inch, and then the rest of it has to be open up until 1 inch below the water line. which kind of leads to the first major advantage of fiberglass hulls, is to find out where that water line is. You can, with a fiberglass hull, they come as basically a solid piece like this. This one's partially cut actually, but it comes as a solid piece of fiberglass from a mold, and then you cut out where you want the ribs to go and where all the other features need to go. And so if you already kind of know where it floats because you've already put it in the water with about the correct amount of weight on it, then you should roughly know where the water line and the 1 inch below the water line should go. After that, after you've marked it all up, you'll take your solid hull like this. This one is marked up and started to be cut. I generally use masking tape to find the marks where I want to go, and then I'll put a 1/4 inch or less drill bit on the drill and hit the corners so that I don't overcut it, and leave it just slightly rounded with a little strength. Sometimes the Dremel will clean that up too. And then you end up cutting it out just like this. One of the other disadvantages of fiberglass hulls are that they just come as basically an open book basically. So any other features such as the deck and subdeck, or little pieces of plastic that you'll need to put the internal armor on, or water channeling, which you'll see more examples of that in a minute. It doesn't have anything in there, so there's a lot of other features that need to be added that would be otherwise something you could add from the get-go, from the earliest parts of construction of a wood hull. Another limitation of fiberglass hulls is that they are a manufactured product that has some limitations in which ships you can select. The ships that are available are generally, good enough as far as they're competitive, but there isn't every ship available. If you want to build something that is not available, then you either have to build something your own, or if it's a very similar hull, sometimes I've seen ships modified to become other ships. Or if the person that built the mold for the hull itself didn't do a very good job, sometimes they'll actually be off a little bit, and so you'll have to change the features so that they mesh up better with if you have high quality prints, which is something that I found with the Fiberglass Unitas hull back here, is that the casements were wrong, so I had to cut them out, and I'll be modeling them myself just because they were not built correctly. So you have to be a little bit aware of that. Most of the hulls that I've seen have been pretty good, or pretty close. But other than that, fiberglass hulls are a relative time save. You get this complete product that if you just want to slap together and drive it around and look pretty, you can certainly do that. But if you want to get it ready for combat like we do, you have to make these modifications to it, and it's way faster. It's pretty messy, but it's not super complicated. The hardest part is laying it out and knowing where you want to cut. The actual cutting of it only probably takes an hour, and it'll dull a Dremel bit or two, but otherwise it's not too bad. And it saves all kinds of hours in getting to the same state a wood hull would take significantly longer. So that's kind of the fiberglass hull. It's easiest to compare and contrast it by just kind of taking a look at the next one down the line here. So this is the Derflinger World War I battle cruiser. It's one of the first wood hulls I made, so there's certainly some things that I did not do very well in it, but there are some certain features that I would say are typical approaches to the way that I think about building wood hulls. This hull is now over 10 years old, and it's held up pretty well to the test of time, but as with fiberglass, wood hull does not really, any material doesn't really love getting hit by BBs repeatedly, and you will have to do some degree of repair. So this is pretty evident in the deck here. This is in the middle of a refit. I stripped it down to nothing, which is kind of why I wanted to show it, because it's really empty and you can kind of see the wood itself, but you can see where it's taken damage and had to be stripped down and repaired. Generally I'll use an epoxy to cover wood to give it some degree of durability. The initial epoxy I used on this ship was really soft, and so it didn't hold up as well as I would have liked to. And so you can see it really kind of took some damage over time, but you know, sanding it down and a couple of coats of epoxy makes it good enough to kind of roll again at some point. We'll get this back on the water. So yeah, an advantage of wood hulls then is basically if you have a decent plan set, you can take the hull lines and plan views and turn it into a ship, and you can build any ship you want within the context of the rules. So as I said, the top part is generally going to be very similar. I would probably build this the same if I was making this part the same as if I was making a wood or fiberglass hull. And I generally make my decks out of wood because it is pretty easy to work with. I've seen people make this out of fiberglass sheets. Fiberglass sheets are a little bit heavy for the thickness, so you can use really thin ones and it still gets a little bit heavy, but it's kind of hard to work with compared to wood. But it theoretically should not have problems with like warping and taking the same types of BB damage, though I've seen them crack. Let's take this off as well. So we can take a look at the insides and kind of be able to describe how and why I did some of these things. So I'll first off say that there's basically two approaches to building wood hulls. Either way, you're going to want to kind of get the outline, the shape of the deck and subdeck. You're going to want to get that figured out, and then basically you're going to build ribs. And you can put it together kind of a couple ways. With larger boats, what I do is I do a baseboard, and with smaller boats, I actually build them upside down. So I've included behind this is a cruiser. This is a French cruiser, the Tourville, and this is also currently a roughly 10-year-old boat that's getting some much needed love and upgrades, and I'm trying some new things with it to try to make it last and make it competitive again. And basically, small boats I would build upside down. I would take the subdeck, put it upside down. Take your ribs. This is just a rib that was left over from some other project. I don't even remember which one. I messed up or something on it, so I had to just chuck it, but I stuck it in a drawer and still have it. And then basically you insert the ribs wherever you need them, and then once you kind of have that structure, then you take thin strips of plywood, like 1/32 inch plywood, or even skinnier, and then you plank it, and you can kind of see underneath the fiberglass cloth all the planks there. And then once the planks are in place, then you put fiberglass cloth over it. And I generally use epoxy, a 2-part epoxy. West Systems works really good, and it's very strong, and it will hold up forever essentially, as long as you do a decent job with it, and with maybe some refinishing as you go over the years, but it holds up generally very well. You can kind of see them too on the inside, the effect that the strips of very thin plywood on the bottom of the hull essentially just makes it so it's a nice thin little strip there. The other method then is as a baseboard. So the very center of this ship has a 1/4 inch piece of 5-ply solid piece of plywood in it that I essentially laid out first, and then I notched it to accept the ribs and glued the ribs in there, and then glued the deck and subdeck on top of that. The advantages of doing that are that it allows you to build in the water channeling as you go. So you basically just cut out a strip down the center of it. In this boat, I was able to take a router, and then I carved out a piece for a very thin strip of plywood. Again, I think it's 32nd inch plywood to go right over the top, and then I fiberglass over the entire thing with usually a couple layers. I usually would do this sort of approach in the mid section of most capital ships that are going to require a water channeling down the middle. During smaller ships like cruisers don't typically need a thin strip of water channeling down the middle. So it's basically adding weight for not a lot of benefit. But it also adds a whole bunch of strength to a big, wide, thick ship like this. You don't really need to do that. Basically, I say you need this water channeling from turret to turret. So somewhere from the A and B turrets are most ships pretty close to each other, and then somewhere in the back, the C turrets and D turrets in the ship kind of sit here. So you do that in the middle, and then you use sort of a keel. Use sort of a keel for the rest of it to kind of tie in and take the shape of the rest of the bow, where it gets a lot skinnier. And the same thing is true in the stern. You use a keel to kind of take the shape, and then after you've got that in, you've got your ribs in, what you can do is take any material, but in this case, balsa wood, very light, easily sandable, and I just glue blocks in and then sand it to shape to mesh with the ribs. And the reason you do this is that you can build water channeling right into the ship as you go. So when you're maneuvering and battling, you don't really want the water to all wash to one part of the ship and throw the balance off and let it start to list and lean. So essentially in every ship, cruisers included, you're going to want up to the bottom of the impenetrable window filled with some sort of material that keeps water out of there. So this is balsa, and then I covered with various layers of epoxy and fiberglass. I didn't initially do a good job of how much strength I added to this, so it actually, the first year or two, took some damage that I had to go back and refinish, and you can really see evidence of that in BB damage and rust damage into the actual fiberglass itself in the bulges here. Again, most capital ships will also benefit from roughly some degree of water channeling in the sides, where it keeps the water from pouring sideways as you turn, sloshing all sideways into the bulges and then causing you to take on a list. That kind of keeps some of the water a little more balanced as you're driving. You want the water to stay in the middle of the ship as much as possible and go to the pump as much as possible. So that's the point of that. And it's just something that you build into the hull itself as you're going when you're building a wood ship. So though the labor is much, much more intensive, some of the stuff that you would then have to add back to a fiberglass hull, you would not necessarily have to do with something like a wood hull. That's kind of an important feature with wood hulls. Another thing I would say that, this ship does have a stringer too. It's a very, very small armor bulge on this ship. It barely sticks out. But some of these things you can get a little creative with a wood hull. This is a piece of steel. I would not do this anymore if I rebuilt this ship. It's an 1/8 inch thick piece of steel that I put the one in the stern. I built that later. That's aluminum, and so I would use aluminum, which is what I'm doing for very thin features on boats like stringers. Now that I build, I just essentially cut out part of the rib to accept the piece of material, and you can bend it to shape and ram it in there. Wood hull wood is a relatively easy material to work with, like I was saying, and so when you mess up and forget to put cross braces in for stability, you can always go back and find various ways to, as ugly as they are, mesh them back in and get it to work. I guess, if you're doing a fiberglass hull, that is sometimes necessary as well. And you can repair fiberglass if you're in other materials to some degree, depending on what your material is. I wouldn't imagine it's very easy to fix a broken piece of aluminum. You might have to just replace the whole thing. But wood, you can just sand it down and put a new piece in and re-epoxy it like crazy, and it should hopefully hold. But otherwise, the end product is fairly similar between wood and fiberglass. I don't know that there's is necessarily competitive advantages, other than, again, with wood hulls you can kind of make the water channeling as you go, though you're spending much more time in the project. Again, wood hulls, another thing that you can see evidence that this is be easy too. When it comes to put your internal armor here, so things don't come and damage the internal components of your ship, it's easy to just kind of hang it on to the thick rib here, whereas on a fiberglass hull, the the thickness of the material doesn't really allow you to just affix the internal armor necessarily right to it very easily. Oftentimes I screw mine in, and so I like having something a little thicker to screw it into. The ship selection too is something that I like in terms of wood hulls, and also just the ability to kind of just build something. I think it's fun to build these things, and it's though it takes a lot of time and effort, it's something that you really, you know, if you're just starting out, a tabletop scroll saw and disc sander are enough to kind of get one of these things built, and you learn a lot as you go about woodworking. I should say that for pretty much everything I'm using 5-ply birch plywood, 1/4 inch sections versus you know, this would be 1/4 inch here, this would be 1/4 inch here, this would be 1/4 inch sub deck, and then 1/8 inch for the deck, and then various pieces like the planks in there would be 5 or 3 ply, and the bottom here would be 5 or 3 ply, much thinner plywood. And then again, yeah, you're using fiberglass cloth and epoxy to kind of give it the rigidity and strength of the actual finished product then before you go and get it shot all up. So that's kind of the discussion. There's good and bad things about building ships in either fashion. I'd say that you know, the wood hull is something that if you have the ambition, I don't know if it's necessarily cheaper by the time you get all your materials taken care of and your time spent and new tools bought that you didn't know you needed. I'm not certain it's cheaper. It's quite rewarding, and it certainly is slower. I would tell people to do something that allows you to get a ship on the water, and whether that's building the entire thing yourself or making a fiberglass one. Your first one, no matter what you do, is going to have errors in it, and you're going to have things that you didn't do correctly because you didn't know exactly what you're doing. But that's life, and that's all stuff that can be improved upon over time as you learn. And as we see here, the ship is 10 years old, and I'm still trying to make improvements on it. So that really doesn't change regardless of what material your ship is made of. So with that, we'll close the video, and I will thank you for watching.